This presentation will focus on the modern age of comics, which begins roughly in the year 2000 and continues into the present day. As we're going to discuss in a bit, though, the modern age begins with what is expected to be the death of the medium. There's a significant crash in sales and popularity, but this really opened the door for comics creators to try new innovations and push the medium forward. So the modern age, this age that we're in right now, is, in my opinion, one of the more interesting in terms of innovation in a very long time. All right, so like I said, we're going to begin with it is what was expected to be the end of the medium. Um, Referred to as the Great Comics Crash of 1996, which is a bit of a misnomer because nothing actually really happened in 1996 other than comic book publishers finally started to notice that they were having issues with sales. In the 80s and the 90s, many new comic book stores had opened. They were mostly run by inexperienced owners who did not have any knowledge about how to run a business. They were comic book fans, right? They were collectors, but they did not know business or how to run a bookstore or anything really about the process of comic book sales. Um, so that meant that there were um, just not a lot of knowledge, not a lot of know-how, and so they made a lot of mistakes. There were also just thousands of titles being produced, so many titles that the market became what we call oversaturated with so much content that it was difficult for people to predict what was going to be successful beyond like those mainstream superhero titles. And those mainstream superhero titles started having kind of like spin-off series. So there would be 3 to 4 series for each superhero kind of going on simultaneously. And because of this, these inexperienced comic book store owners um, often made purchasing mistakes. They literally couldn't buy everything that was available because it wouldn't fit inside of that brick and mortar store. And that expense the expense began to rise on not only original titles, but for the older comics because collectors were into the market now. Um, and it got complicated with different sales gimmicks as well. Um, so people didn't know what to buy, they didn't know what to sell. Collectors were looking for old things, not new things, and it just got really messy. And so one of the things that people, or a lot of things that people tried to do, comic book companies in particular, comic book stores as well, was that they tried to find ways to kind of like fill that financial gap for themselves. And one company in particular, Marvel, got really involved in sales gimmicks and then they went bankrupt. Um, so, um, in 1997, Marvel goes bankrupt. The guy who was running the company at the time, his name was Perlman, and he gets a really bad rap. But he was also dealing with a lot of those market issues that I was describing to you before. Um, so he proposed that the Marvel company combine or consolidate with a toy company, and that would save the company because they could kind of spread out their profit and enjoy some of these gimmicks. One of which was creating toys for series. Um, Carl Icahn, he was a businessman who had no real connection to comics, tried to block Perlman's plan by buying up a bunch of stock in Marvel. Um, but ultimately, the toy company did buy Marvel, and essentially bailed them out. And then, in an attempt to kind of uh, make up those losses, Marvel leaned really heavily into toy production and then a couple of other gimmicks that were going on. They weren't the only company to do this. In fact, most comic book companies at the time engaged in these sales gimmicks. Um, some of them weren't clearly gimmicks, though, like looking back on it, we recognize it now. For one thing, mini series were relaunched or started over in an attempt to gain new audiences. But The current fans got really frustrated because they felt like the older series weren't being properly wrapped up because they just kind of ended. Um, that preponderance of those new series made it difficult for fans to know what to buy next because there was never a guarantee that a title was going to stick around. Um, they started making what we call variant covers. I've got some posters of some Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics in my room right now that I can show you, but there's four different covers, one for each of the Ninja Turtles, and that's what I mean by a variant cover. Like there would be the same issue, but with like two to four, sometimes more covers, which was an attempt to get people to like buy the same thing multiple times so they could collect all the covers. Another thing that they did was create what we call hollow foil covers, which you can see pictured here on the slide. And these were like these kind of 2D hologram things that tried to make them look 3D. They were basically just kind of like shiny silver, and like you would bend them and it would look like the character was moving. Um, Many comics became even more expensive than the cover price because the stores decided to sell them in what we call pre-bagged. So you can see the comic book here in the image is $3.95 at the time. But if you put a plastic sleeve on it and sold it with a sleeve on it, then they could charge maybe $4.95 for it, and the baggies themselves were not very expensive at all. Sometimes it would add what's called a board, which is a cardboard piece that was put behind the comic in an effort to prevent it from getting bent up. And that again would add to the price. And part of this is nice in the sense that they're kind of predicting that the comic was going to be successful enough or important enough, and they wanted to protect it. But again, nobody knew what was going to stick around or was going to be successful. Um, Comic book publishers and comic book stores also began to sell trading cards, card games, and toys as collectibles. A lot of these were thematic based on the comics themselves, but they also included other stuff too. This is the rise of Magic the Gathering as a card game. And so those things would be sold in comic book stores. And while this is super common now, back in the 90s, this was not a normal thing. And it was not as successful as they expected it to be. And so Marvel got in to also a sticker foil business because foil stickers were really popular in the UK, and they thought they were going to be popular here. They were wrong. Basically, none of it really worked out. Um, and then probably the biggest gimmick of them all was something called the death of Superman. Um, and um, I don't know that it was intended to be a gimmick, but it's definitely been criticized by fans historically as being like a sales grab. So early in the 90s, the Superman series was struggling to sell more than 150,000 copies a week, and it was significantly less popular than Marvel titles. News outlets found out that DC was planning to kill Superman and announced that before the comic book company claims that they wanted people to know. There's some speculation that they were the ones who leaked it. Um, this can be partially credited with the arc's success. So the news coverage um, gave it like a lot of free press. And so the issue ended up selling, issue 75 ended up pre-selling 5 million copies to comic book stores. The copies came with a sticker, a poster, and black armbands that fans could wear as if mourning Superman. So a lot of gimmicks got wrapped up into this particular title. Publishers also convinced buyers to purchase aligned issues, so like the issues that were coming immediately before and immediately after, um, or were like spin-off series, in the hopes that that the increased attention for the death of Superman would get comic book readers to buy and purchase other items in the store. And this failed. It left retailers with tons of comics that nobody wanted and nobody was buying. And this moment in time, the 5 million pre-sales to the stores of issue 75, Death of Superman, um, that did not land with fans. They did not purchase it in the droves that they were expecting. This is often credited with the beginning of the end of the comics boom. Many fans also didn't realize that the death wasn't going to be permanent. So he died, and then 3 months later, they brought him back. And so a lot of fans felt really betrayed because they had gone through like the mourning and the loss of this iconic character. And the news coverage made it seem like this was going to be a permanent thing. And so they lost a lot of readers through that. People kind of like boycotted DC in a way. Um, so again, nothing specific happened in 1996 other than the comic book companies started to see the writing on the wall. The sales were dropping. It wasn't until 2001, though, that what we call the death knell for comics was really rung. And that was the lowest day of sales in history. Only 67 million copies of any comic was sold in 2001, which is a massive contrast to the 5 million copies of The Death of Superman that was sold in a single day. All right. So, the biggest trend of the modern age. This is the rise of the graphic novel. Now, this might be called the rise of the graphic novel, but graphic novels actually existed before the modern age. The first graphic novel was authored by the iconic Will Eisner. You will know him pretty well because he is the one who designed the D and the W for Walt Disney Studios. He wrote a book called A Contract with God and published this in 1978. It was the first story of its kind that was told in the comics medium, but was published as a single collected work, never appearing as individual comic book issues. It was a complete book of a full story length. Eisner really thought that this format was going to take off, but it didn't in the 70s. He was eventually right, but it just wasn't super popular at the time, probably because of all of the stigmas that were surrounding comics at the time. Um, but then in the 1990s, there was the publication of two different graphic novels. Mouse, pictured here, by Art Spiegelman, and Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. They're both memoirs, meaning that they are someone telling their own story. And um, they proved to readers that the medium could handle really complicated stories in a literary way. Mouse even won a Pulitzer Prize for Peace, securing it in what we refer to as, oops, sorry guys, the comics canon, um, and leading schools and teachers to finally start bringing comics into the classroom. Um, so, Persepolis tells the story of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Um, and both of them, again, are their memoirs, so they're told from the perspectives of the people who lived them. Mouse, Art Spiegelman is telling his father's story, and it's interspersed with his own experiences. Um, so these two foundational texts were published in the 90s, but that was really kind of it until the early 2000s. And then since then, we have seen a preponderance of the graphic novel format in different fields and genres, including the memoirs and biographies like Mouse and Persepolis, but also textbooks, realistic fiction, historical fiction. And we'll talk about those genres here in just a bit. All right, another trend of the modern age. The diverse characters, of course, started in the Silver Age, right? We had um, female characters, characters of color, um, show up in the Silver Age, and then in the Bronze and Dark Ages, they started to get their own titles. In the modern age, we saw a different kind of shift. So, this is a quick reminder. In the Silver Age, we had non-white male characters who were typically like supporting or background roles. In the Bronze Age, they started to get their own series. And we saw that continue through the Dark Age. But the modern age, they started to replace characters within popular series with diverse characters. So the superheroes, the title of like Captain Marvel or a Captain America, these became mantles and they could be passed from character to character. So like Captain America was not one guy. It was the shield, the uniform, and that could be passed to somebody else when the original hero was wanting to retire or died or something like that. Um, Now, there's definitely a precedent to this concept before the modern age. Captain Marvel, in particular, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about um, Shazam. Um, but Captain Marvel, as a mantle, has been worn by many characters, including Kree Marvel, Monica Rambeau, who was a police detective who later becomes Photon, Janice Vell, a Marvel's son, Phyla Vell, Marvel's daughter, and Janice Vell's sister, Knur, a Skrull sleeper agent, Navarre, another Kree who was charged with protecting Earth and later becomes Marvel Boy. And of course, now we have the famous Carol Danvers, who started out as Miss Marvel. Um, so we had this already kind of established as a possibility, and this just expanded into other series. So the superhero mantles that were typically inhabited by white folks or aliens from other planets got replaced by people of color or women. Carol Danvers, who was white, was originally Miss Marvel. She gets replaced by Kamala Khan, a Pakistani American. Peter Parker, who was white, was replaced by Miles Morales, who was biracial. And of course, Steve Rogers, Captain America, was replaced by Sam Wilson, formerly Falcon. This transition in particular had a massive impact socially um, on the world, not just on the US. Many longtime comic fans pushed back on the switch, especially um, because the reason the switch happened was because it turned out that Steve Rogers was actually a Hydra sleeper agent the whole time, like through his entire history. He was a Nazi. Um, so people got pissed off about that. It literally broke the internet for a day. And it had some other social implications too. Rogers, being a Nazi, empowered racists to feel comfortable with their racism. And the kind of explosion of racist rhetoric about Sam Wilson's character was staggering. Um, and it kind of, honestly, it kind of didn't just break the internet, it broke comics for a little while. Um, if you have seen, um, oh gosh, I can't remember which Avengers movie it is. I think it's the first of the Infinity War one. But there's a scene in that film where Steve Rogers, as Captain America, is in an elevator and he's surrounded by Hydra agents, and they all kind of like look at him, and he says, "Hail Hydra," and that is a homage to the uh, one of the like first three pages of this comic where this happened. Um, and so they were kind of being like tongue in cheek and kind of changing it back, bringing Steve Rogers back into the fold, and making him not a Hydra agent again. But again, this really like it changed people's perspectives and it made people realize just how important the um, comics as a whole really were socially. Um, some other mantles that got diversified. Thor was replaced by Jane Foster. You guys have all seen Love and Thunder. It was a comic first. Spider-Gwen was another replacement for Spider-Man in one of the multiverse narratives. It's also a title that dealt with superhero pregnancy. Um, and then it should be important to note here that while the demographics of the characters changed at this time, that did not mean that the author demographics changed. This was still a business predominantly taken up by white men. Miles Morales, for instance, who is biracial, he's Puerto Rican and so Hispanic and Black. He is written by a white guy, and that author is often criticized for not being able to write the character in an authentic way that deals with his identity. Um, the other thing that happens with diverse characters is they retooled a lot of these narratives. In addition to retooling these narratives and shifting the mantles to non-white characters, we started to see many titles featuring diverse characters that were original storylines. So they weren't embedded in some other superhero. Um, One example is America, featuring America Chavez, which brought us a queer Latina superhero for the first time. She was incredibly well received by fans and critics, but was not popular with Marvel's main white male audience. So the series ended up being short-lived with only 12 issues ever being published. Though she was popular enough to be brought into the Avengers series and the MCU. Um, Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur was introduced to us, Lunella Lafayette, a black preteen who Marvel themselves considers to be the smartest character in their multiverse. She has the ability to switch bodies with a time-traveling devil dinosaur who lands in her time period after being transferred from his original comic book. He had his own. This one ran from 2015 to 2019, and this title really defied Marvel's expectations. Um, Single issue sales in comic book stores were abysmal. They did not sell. But the collected editions were incredibly successful at elementary school book fairs through Scholastic. Some of you might remember Scholastic book fairs from your elementary school days. And this caused Marvel to realize that different audiences purchase comics in different ways. Elementary and middle school readers aren't spending a lot of time in comic book stores. Rather, traditional bookstores, school book fairs, or even tablet sales were where these audiences were going to find titles. Um, Image Comics brought us Fence, which features an all-boys cast at an all-boys school. It's incredibly diverse with Black, Asian, Hispanic, and white characters, as well as authentic gay and bisexual characters and relationships. And of course, um, one of the most famous graphic novels and most award-winning graphic novels of all time is New Kid, which features Jordan Banks. He's a black middle schooler and artist who attends a private school to appease his mother. The book garnered critical acclaim for its take on real world issues and how it addressed systemic racism in a really nuanced and authentic way. It's one of the most heavily awarded books. It's got like 5 or 6 different awards now. But it's also one of the most banned books um, in the past few years because it deals with issues of systemic racism. It should also be noted that while the comic takes on these issues, they are not the focus of the book at all. They're just present because that's something that people who are people of color face in their daily lives. So it's just trying to show Jordan's authentic experience. All right, another trend of the modern age is the return of the child-friendly story. So the Dark Age, of course, was known for its dark and violent storylines, which were wildly inappropriate for younger audiences. Um, but one of the things that tends to happen with popular culture is something called a pendulum swing. So once one trend oversaturates a market, that causes the market to go the complete opposite direction, and that's what happened in the early 2000s. So as comic book fans um, got older, the comics had aged with them, right? Getting more and more and more mature. But then comic book publishers didn't really think about like, okay, what's going to happen when these people die? We need to like get the kids to read comics so that we can continue selling our books. So they weren't developing a new readership. So traditional publishers, publishers of prose books, decided to fill that gap in the late aughts and early 2000 teens. So graphic novels, this is part of why they rose, is because they were designed for kids. They were intended for predominantly for children, for preteen audiences, and they boomed in the recent years. It's the fastest growing area in comics at the moment. Um, and these stories run the gambit. They're all kinds of genres. They feature a wide range of diverse characters. There's literally something for everyone in the graphic novel format, especially for young readers. And so this is the probably the major reason, or one of the major reasons that I say that this is definitely a new era, because um, this particular trend prompted a lot of us to recognize that, oh, we're seeing something different from those dark age narratives. This is more kind of lighthearted. I mean, not that there aren't dark stories for young kids, it's not the same. All right, another trend of the era is a genre explosion. We had a lot of genres back in the Golden Age, right? A lot of those disappeared. They start to come back um, at the end of the Bronze Age and into the Dark Age, but here is where the explosion really happens, and we start to see things come back with a vengeance. In fiction, let's see. Well, we had, of course, the fantasy and horror stories that came back with the Dark Age, but a lighter side of fantasy popped up in the modern age, and what's the other one? Intellectual horror, so more like thrillers. So not like just kind of violence and gore like Spawn. It was more like like spy stuff or like cop stories. Um, Then realistic fiction became really popular. This was always a popular trend in Japan with Japanese manga, but it started to get more and more popular here. Books like New Kid by Jerry Craft, Class Act, which is a sequel, they won multiple awards, which drew attention to them. Himawari House is another incredibly popular award. It's the most award-winning graphic novel of 2021. Features some young adults trying to find themselves in a semester abroad in Japan. Um, so that genre expands and explodes. Um, we started to see some blending of genres. So Pride of Baghdad, which is pictured here, is a comic book about a group of lions that escapes from a zoo during a bombing in Baghdad. And the comic features talking lions. That's clearly fantasy, but the event where the lions escape from the zoo in Baghdad, that actually happens. So we start blending genres. We start seeing a lot of what we call speculative fiction, which is where it's a world that's um, very much like our own, but something has is different, slightly different, or something has changed. You see this a lot with like what if stories. So like if this historical event had gone differently, like if the Nazis had won World War II, for example, what would the world look like? 80 Days pictured here is a good example of this. Um, it features three characters that are trying to find like happiness and freedom while living in with a fascist regime. The author Acius Guerra is a Filipino author. So it deals a lot with the kind of colonialism and oppression of the Philippines without actually saying that. Um, and then sports fiction in comics becomes huge. You can see Dragon Hoops here by Jean Luen Yang, who is the author also of American Born Chinese. In nonfiction, this genre exploded even more than fiction. The comics medium is actually like a really exceptional way to present nonfiction text and informational content because it allows you to represent ideas visually. So, like, try to represent the water cycle without drawing a picture, for example. If you describe it with words alone, it makes no sense and takes a lot more writing than it does to just draw like a diagram. So writers and publishers realized this and decided to capitalize on that. So um, these genres are second only to child-friendly comics in making graphic novels the highest selling and fastest growing trend of the modern age. So we get memoir and biography comics, telling people's stories like Relish over here. Um, we see informational texts like Human Body Theater that teach you about the body, historical texts like Treaties, Trenches, Mud, and Blood that tells the history of World War One in kind of like a tongue-in-cheek, kind of funny, sarcastic way. And then even stuff about current events. So like Drowned City is the story of Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans. And so these things are starting to come out not too long after the events occurred. Um, Another big trend of the modern age is the film adaptation. Um, After Marvel went bankrupt in 1997, the company tried a lot of things to stay afloat, including creating a trading card game. They produced collectible stickers. They marketed toys to children and adults, but they also started selling the rights to their comics to film companies. They specifically rejected television. They were worried that the longevity of those recurring episodes was going to draw audiences away from the comics themselves. Like people weren't going to go buy the issues if they could watch the show. Um, and some film adaptations were really successful. Um, the X-Men franchise was huge. DC had the Dark Knight films. Um, some other movies that got adapted were, or comics that got adapted were V for Vendetta, The 300, Sin City, and they were all successful. And they brought non-mainstream superhero stories to a larger audience, which made people want to buy the books. Not all of them were successful, though. Other films, especially Marvel films, were critical disasters. The 2003 Daredevil adaptation attempted way too much, including Matt Murdock's origin story, his doomed love affair with Elektra, battles with Kingpin and Bullseye. Um, and then for some reason, they decided to build on the lack of popularity of Daredevil and do an Elektra spinoff film, which was even more poorly received and was widely considered the worst superhero film of all time until Jonah Hex in 2010. Ghost Rider is considered poorly written, poorly produced, poorly directed, and poorly acted. But of course, they hired Nick Cage, so I don't know what they were expecting. Um, Another issue that Marvel had in particular is that they didn't anticipate this problem, or they didn't anticipate this being a problem down the road, but they spread their content across multiple production companies. So multiple companies owned the rights to their stories, which became a problem when they decided to do the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So because they didn't own the rights, um, that meant that they couldn't bring certain characters like Spider-Man into the franchise right away. Um, so it's interesting that they were able to dominate the film market for a while. DC started to develop their cinematic multiverse as well, but that was much less positively received. It was got a lot of critical reception. Fans seemed to like it, but only if they were already fans of DC. So Marvel just kind of remained popular because it appealed to these new audiences who hadn't read the comics, but they could follow the storylines. DC has been criticized as being poorly written, rushed character development, rushed storylines, lack of a clear connectivity between the films and different characters. Um, but DC fans tend to be a bit more diehard than Marvel fans, so that's why they've continued to have some success. In contrast to their film reception, DC's television adaptations have had a much stronger run than Marvel, especially early on in the modern age. The CW collaboration with DC created the Arrowverse, which sustained the network for years. It kept the CW afloat. Um, and it actually enticed buyers for a while. It looked like the company wasn't going to go bankrupt. Eventually, they did. DC's less famous content has also found a really positive reception in TV and streaming adaptations, with Sandman, The Boys, and Preacher all gaining critical acclaim with massive audiences. Other comic book publishers got in the game too for TV shows. The Walking Dead was and is still one of Image Comics' flagship series. Lock and Key is an IDW title, which is on Netflix, and the Umbrella Academy brought a resurgence to the Dark Horse comic book publishing company, just to name a few. Check all of these out; they're all incredibly good. Another trend we saw with graphic novels was the adaptation of prose and drama into graphic novel form. This began early in the 2000s with the adaptations of classics or canonical texts. I remember seeing an Americanized manga style graphic novel version of Romeo and Juliet in a college bookstore in like 2006, I think. Um, so Shakespeare classes were reading these instead of the original play. The idea was that schools could use them to teach classics to reluctant readers, and that the new format might appeal to new audiences. Later in like the early 20 teens, we begin to see graphic novel adaptations of popular children's and young adult novels. And then both types of adaptations have been met with varying success. Some are really successful, some are not so much. Some of the early ones were produced by companies that had no experience with comic book creation, and so the art fell a little flat. Um, Continuing with adaptations, we started to see audiobook adaptations, which is such an interesting concept because you're moving from a visual medium into an auditory one. Um, Traditional publishers, like non comic book publishers, are kind of famous for turning their prose books into audiobooks. And so they wanted to try the same thing with comics, and it's been fairly successful. They kind of function like old radio plays. They have different actors voicing characters. There's music that can set mo mood and tone. There's sound effects that stand in for the onomatopoeias in the comics. Um, and most are really well produced. We also see a lot of other digital formats. Web comics are comics originally designed for the web. They resemble comic strips or funnies that used to appear in newspapers. Many of them have since been published as physical books, though. So they went from web to physical. Um, then we have digital comics, guided view, motion book, and motion comics, which we'll take a look at real quick because we're running out of time. Um, Digital comics are sometimes called digital immigrant comics. Um, and these are basically just scanned pages. You can see it in the first image here. There's just a page and you just kind of scroll through it. Then there's something called guided view, which allows the screen to zoom in on particular panels and focus in on what is visible there. Um, it can zoom in on the text, it can slide across the image, it does kind of a zigzag Z path reading for you. And then the third one is something called, oops, motion book, which for whatever reason is not functioning right now. Um, but basically, they added audio and like animations inside the comic book pages on of digital comics themselves. Um, Motion books really started to gain popularity right before the pandemic, like the 2 years before the pandemic. There was an app called Madefire that shared its animation algorithms with DeviantArt, inviting artists to create motion books. But the platform died during the pandemic. They didn't have enough funding to keep it going. Um, and then there's this thing called motion comics. I'm not actually going to play this for you. You guys can go find these on your own. Watchmen's motion comic is probably the most famous, so I recommend taking a look at that one. But they basically take the comic book and kind of turn it into short animated films or cartoons. It's more challenging than an animated cartoon because they had to take the original artwork and figure out how to animate it. And one of the things that would happen is like backgrounds were never completely full. Like you had to, like when you have a person standing in front of a background in a comic, that piece behind them never got drawn. So they would have to kind of like patch all of these holes. Um, but in motion comics, you'll see characters move, you'll have sound effects, you'll have music. Um, it's like a poorly animated cartoon. So there's a few you can take a look at that. The final trend of this time is something called transmedial text. It becomes a norm. A transmedial text is a story that requires you to engage with it across multiple platforms. So, Star Wars, for example, you have the movies that all tell a narrative, but in between these movies, other things happen. There are TV shows, there are comic books, there are video games, and all of these are considered what they call canon, meaning they are part of the official storyline. And if you watch, read, play, game with all of it, you get the complete and total story. Marvel is another one of these. DC has obviously tapped into this model, but there's also a lot of other different series that have tried these. And now prose books, chapter books are trying to do the same thing. So yeah, a lot going on in the modern age, a lot of new innovations and trends.